As a visitor travels through your website, you don't necessarily want to display the same ads to them on every page. Now you can simply place a different ad on each page, or you could set up a script that randomly selects an ad each time a page is displayed. But what I'm going to show you today is a way to show a specific sequence of ads to each visitor, regardless of what course they take as they travel through your site. I'm actually going to show you two ways to do the same thing today to demonstrate two of TriggerNote's features. The first one is a little bit more difficult for this particular example, but would be more appropriate for other examples. What we have is a web page called story.php, and then 5 different ads that tell parts of a story that we want displayed on the page in sequence. In this example, I'm displaying all the ads on the same page simply by refreshing the page. But in a real-world example, they would be displayed on different pages as a person clicked around your site. So let's look at the source code of the page. Right here, this div, whose ID is AdBox, is where we're going to display the ads. So let's create a trigger set and give it a name. And then we'll need multiple triggers to determine which page to display. So I'll create a trigger group. And before I start adding the settings to display the different parts of the story, we need to set up a cookie that's going to determine which part of the story to display each time the visitor views a page. We'll set the cookie to update as early as possible in the page load process. And then we'll select the action Update Tracking Cookie. By default, the tracking cookie is simply named TriggerNote, but you can add something to the end of it if you want to. For example, we could say TriggerNote Story, and then we need to be sure to use the same cookie name with all of the other settings that are using this same cookie. We'll just leave this blank. We don't need this particular cookie to hang around very long, so we'll just set it to expire in 1 day. We'll leave the path as a single slash, which means that the cookie will be returned for every page on your site. So we're done setting up the tracking cookie. And now we'll set up a trigger that triggers off of the value of the tracking cookie. Again, we'll leave this field blank since we left it blank before. And then we'll choose a tracking cookie option. TriggerNote's tracking cookie can trigger based on when the person first visited your site, how many days ago they first visited your site, when the last day was that they visited your site, the total number of days on which they have visited your site at least once, or the number of pages they've viewed on your site today. To display the first segment of the story, we'll select Page Views Today is less than 2, or in other words, this is the first page view of the day. To display the content, we'll use the Load URL into Page recipe, and we'll enter the URL of the first segment of our story. And you'll remember the ID of the div that we wanted to display it in was AdBox. Next, we'll add the settings for displaying segment 2. For this segment, we need to add a trigger group because we'll need 2 tracking cookie tests. And both of these tests will need to be triggered in order to display segment 2. For the first test, we want to check whether the number of page views today is more than 1. And for the second, we'll check whether it's less than 3, or in other words, 2. And once again, we'll use the Load URL into Page recipe to display the content. Now we'll repeat the same thing for segment 3, which will display if our page views are greater than 2 and less than 4. And we'll repeat the same thing again for segment 4. Now, one thing that I'll point out here is that it's important to be careful about where you add the actions. The action settings right here apply only to this one tracking cookie test. So it would trigger any time our number of page views today is less than 5 instead of only on the 4th page view. This here is the correct place to specify these actions. One way to avoid placing your actions in the wrong section when using trigger groups is to collapse each trigger section before adding the actions. With those collapsed, it's obvious that this is the correct place to add these actions. So once again, we'll apply our recipe. And then for the last page, we don't need a trigger group because we only need to check whether the number of page views is greater than 4, and then we'll just keep displaying segment 5 from there on out. Of course, you could cycle through the story over and over by adding an action to delete the tracking cookie when displaying segment 5. So with that, we have an action in the onload section to update the tracking cookie, and then settings for displaying each of the 5 story segments. So let's save our trigger set, copy the trigger set number, 40. We'll edit our web page, paste that number in, save that, and now when we reload the page, you'll see that the first segment of the story is displayed. Then when I reload the page, or in a real-world example, when someone clicks from one page to another on your site, the second segment is displayed. And if we reload again, the third segment is displayed. Now, of course, your visitors aren't necessarily going to notice what's going on. So first of all, if you're doing something sequential like this, you want to make the difference between the segments eye-catching and also make it clear that they're connected to each other. For people who notice what's happening partway through the story, the link text here, Read Joe's Whole Story, promises them that they'll be able to see the parts that they missed by clicking the link. So we'll reload a few more times and get the 4th and 5th segments, and then if I keep reloading, the 5th segment continues to be displayed. So that's how you can use TriggerNote's tracking cookie to display a content sequence on your website. And while the tracking cookie features will be appropriate for some things that you want to do, there is an easier way to do what I showed you today using TriggerNote's cookie feature rather than the tracking cookie feature. Again, we'll start off by creating a trigger group, and this time we'll use the cookie value trigger. We'll give our cookie a name, we'll just call it story, and the first thing we want to check for is if the cookie does not exist. Then we know we're at the start of the story. So our first action will be to set the cookie value, which we do to create the cookie. We'll give it the same name, story, and set it to expire in 1 day, and then we'll set the value to 1. Next, we'll use the same load URL into page recipe to load the content into the page. And I won't go through all those steps again. Next, we'll add another cookie value trigger, and this time we check if the cookie value is already set to 1, and if it is, we'll use a set cookie value action to increase the value to 2. We'll use the add 1 operation to do that. And then once again use the load URL into page recipe to load the segment of our story. And we would repeat these same steps for segments 3 and 4, but then when we come to segment 5, we do it just a little bit different. Instead of adding 1 to the value of the cookie, we would set its value back to 1. And of course we would use the load URL into page recipe to display segment 5. So there you have one example of how you can use TriggerNote's cookie and tracking cookie features to control who sees what content on your site and when. Thanks for watching.